Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about one of the most disturbing and enigmatic Xenos factions in the history of Warhammer 40k, the Uath. They weren't just another alien race wiped out by the Imperium in some long-forgotten war. No, the Uath were something far worse. They were a civilization that mastered the dark arts of the warp to a degree that even the most fanatical chaos cultists could only dream of. Their empire was built not just on conquest, but on a foundation of suffering, corruption, and the absolute domination of the soul itself. And then, one day, they were gone. Erased from existence, their domains reduced to ruins, their names spoken only in fearful whispers. But what really happened to them? Were they truly destroyed, or did something much darker occur? If we want to understand the Uath Enigma, we need to dig deep into their origins, their rise to power, and the horrifying legacy they left behind. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, nothing ever truly dies. The origins of the Uath are shrouded in mystery, buried beneath layers of Imperial records, half-lost legends, and the eerie silence of the dead worlds they once ruled. Unlike many other Xenos species catalogued by the Imperium, the Uath didn't just appear as another alien empire expanding through brute force or technological superiority. No, they were something far worse, something ancient, something unnatural. Even now, those who dig too deep into their history risk uncovering horrors better left forgotten. What little is known suggests that the Uath were not a traditional species in the way the Eldar, Orcs, or Tau are. There are conflicting accounts of their biology. Some sources claim they were a purely organic species that later embraced radical cybernetic and warp-based augmentation, while others suggest they were never truly biological in the first place. The most chilling theories claim that the Uath were something far more disturbing, an abominable fusion of matter and warp energy, creatures that had long since abandoned a stable physical form in favor of something else. Their culture, if such a thing can even be called that, was entirely centered around domination. Unlike the more conventional slaver empires of history, the Uath didn't just want control over bodies, they sought to own souls. They perfected the dark science of warp sorcery, creating unimaginable technologies that blurred the line between arcane ritual and scientific atrocity. Their very ships and cities pulsed with corrupted energy, twisting the laws of reality itself. They enslaved entire populations, not just through chains and whips, but through absolute psychic subjugation, breaking the wills of their victims until they became little more than vessels for the Uath's dark ambitions. When the Uath first came into contact with other species, they didn't engage in traditional diplomacy or warfare. Instead, they infiltrated. They whispered into the minds of weaker beings, offering power, forbidden knowledge, and the promise of immortality. Many civilizations fell before they even realized they were under attack, their leaders slowly corrupted from within. Those who resisted were not simply annihilated, they were transformed, reshaped into grotesque servitors, or absorbed into the growing nightmare of Uath's empire. The earliest recorded encounters with the Uath suggest that they were already a dying race by the time they clashed with humanity. Whether this was due to infighting, a war with some unknown foe, or the natural consequence of their horrific practices is unknown. Some theories suggest that their addiction to warp energy made their existence increasingly unstable, forcing them to rely on ever more extreme methods to sustain themselves. Others believe that the Uath were never truly a single species to begin with, but rather an amalgamation of entities, a collective of warlocks, abominations, and artificially created horrors that had long since lost any sense of identity beyond their thirst for power. What is undeniable is that by the time the Imperium discovered them, the Uath were already something less than a civilization and more like a festering wound in the fabric of reality. Their domain, the accursed region known as the Calx expanse, was a twisted nightmare of enslaved worlds, corrupted technology, and void ships that drifted through the warp like predatory phantoms. The Imperium, for all its brutality, had never encountered anything quite like this before. To understand the Uath is to stare into the abyss of what happens when a civilization fully embraces the warp, not as a tool, not as a weapon, but as the very foundation of their existence. Unlike the Eldar, who once thought they could control the immaterial and paid the ultimate price, or the forces of chaos, who are at least somewhat constrained by their patron gods, the Uath had no such limitations. They were free to twist reality as they pleased, and in doing so, they became something utterly alien, something wrong. And yet, for all their power, they disappeared. Wiped from history, their once mighty empire reduced to ruins. But how could something so deeply intertwined with the warp, so seemingly invincible, simply vanish? The deeper one digs, the more disturbing the answers become. The Uath remain one of the most unsettling and poorly understood entities in Warhammer 40k lore, largely because so little concrete information about them exists. What scraps of knowledge remain are fragmented, often corrupted by the biases of Imperial scholars, or tainted by the sheer horror of what these beings represented. But the more you piece together, the clearer it becomes that the Uath were not just another Xenos empire, they were something far worse. The biggest mystery surrounding them is their biology. If they even had anything resembling a traditional biological form. The few descriptions that exist paint them as something between flesh and machine, but warped by sorcery to the point that they defied conventional classification. Some believe they started as a species similar to humanity, or the Eldar, but over millennia, they underwent a grotesque transformation, merging with warp energy until they became something else entirely. There are accounts of Uath constructs found deep in ancient ruins, mechanical bodies fused with living tissue, pulsing with an eerie, unnatural energy. Were these bodies prisons for their essence, or did they willingly discard their original forms in pursuit of something greater? This ties directly into their culture, if such a thing can even be defined in normal terms. The Uath were not just conquerors, they were corruptors. Their entire existence revolved around the subjugation of others, but not in the way the Imperium or even the Necrons subjugate. They didn't just want physical dominance, they sought control over the very minds and souls of their victims. It wasn't enough to defeat an enemy, they needed to break them, reshape them, turn them into something new. And they did this not through mere psychic domination, but through an intricate fusion of warp rituals and bizarre eldritch technology. Their technology is where things get truly disturbing. The Uath didn't just use machines, they created devices that bled into the immaterial, powered by suffering, bound to the whims of dark entities. Their ships, their weapons, even their cities were described as living things, thrumming with a presence that defied logic. Some theories suggest that the Uath had gone so far as to create an entire network of warp-powered constructs designed to amplify their own psychic abilities, essentially turning their domain into a massive, self-sustaining engine of corruption. This is what made them so dangerous, not just their raw power, but the way they could twist the very nature of reality itself. First contact with the Uath must have been a nightmare for any species unfortunate enough to cross their path. Unlike the Orcs, who announce their arrival with brutal violence, or the Tau, who at least pretend to offer diplomacy, the Uath didn't operate on a level that made sense to most mortals. Their influence was subtle at first, seeping into civilizations like a slow-moving poison. They didn't need to conquer through war. They could infiltrate, manipulate, and spread their corruption until entire worlds fell under their sway without ever realizing what was happening. Those who did resist faced something far worse than simple extermination. The Uath didn't kill their enemies. They reshaped them. There are whispers of ancient human civilizations that fell under their rule, their populations transformed into mindless thralls or warped abominations. It's even been speculated that some of the more obscure chaos cults operating in the Imperium today could trace their origins back to remnants of Uath influence, the echoes of their corruption never fully eradicated. But even among fans, the true nature of the Uath is still widely debated. Some believe they were an ancient race that simply discovered warp sorcery and became consumed by it, much like the Eldar in their fall. Others theorize that they were never truly a species in the first place, that they were something else entirely, perhaps even an extension of the warp itself, manifesting in physical reality only when it suited their needs. If that's the case, then the question isn't just what happened to them, but whether they were ever truly destroyed at all. The Uath weren't just another civilization that dabbled in warp sorcery. They lived and breathed it, bending the immaterial to their will in ways that defied logic. Even among the most notorious warp wielders of Warhammer 40k, their mastery stood out as something utterly unnatural. They didn't just harness warp energy like psychers or demon worshippers. They manipulated it on a fundamental level, treating it as a tool, a weapon, and even a means of sustaining themselves. To call them mere sorcerers would be an understatement. They were architects of corruption, engineers of the impossible, and perhaps the closest thing the galaxy has ever seen to a race that fully integrated the warp into every aspect of their existence. But how did they do it? How did a Xenos species, largely forgotten by history, reach a level of control over the immaterial that made even chaos cultists look like mere amateurs? The answer lies in their technology, their rituals, and their complete disregard for the boundaries between the material and immaterial worlds. Unlike human psychers, who are either born with their abilities or develop them unpredictably, the Uath seemingly created their own psychic strength. Some theories suggest that they artificially enhanced themselves through arcane bioengineering, splicing warp-sensitive mutations into their own kind until they reached a point where their very existence resonated with the immaterial. Others argue that they never relied on innate psychic talent at all, but rather on vast networks of warp-infused machines, dark engines designed to amplify their influence and anchor their sorcery into reality. One of the most horrifying aspects of their power was how they fueled it. Warp energy, by its nature, is chaotic and unstable, resisting control. Most psychers draw from it cautiously, always at risk of being consumed by its tides. But the Uath seem to have found a way to tame it by feeding it suffering. They didn't just use warp energy, they harvested it, refining it through pain, torment, and the slow, methodical destruction of sentient souls. Entire civilizations were turned into nothing more than batteries for their rituals. Whether through mass sacrifice, forced possession, or twisted psychic experiments, they generated an endless supply of raw, immaterial power, shaping it into whatever nightmarish form they desired. Their technology reflected this philosophy. It wasn't like the cold, calculating machinery of the Necrons or the crude, instinctive constructions of the Orcs. It was something else entirely. Living, pulsating, almost organic in its corruption. Ships that screamed in the void, weapons that drained the very essence from their victims, constructs that were neither fully mechanical nor fully alive. Some Imperial records suggest that Uath artifacts, when activated, don't just function as tools, but as extensions of the warp itself, creating localized anomalies where reality bends, time fractures, and the minds of those nearby unravel. Then there were their rituals, the darkest and most forbidden practices imaginable. If chaos sorcerers are known for their brutal sacrifices and blood-soaked ceremonies, the Uath took things to an entirely different level. Their rites weren't just about summoning demons or seeking the favor of the ruinous powers. They were about reshaping existence itself. They twisted flesh into new, horrifying forms, created self-sustaining warp storms, and forged weapons that could unravel the souls of those they struck. Some believe they even reached the point where they could will themselves into new bodies, abandoning physical decay and existing in a perpetual cycle of rebirth through sheer sorcerous might. It's impossible to say just how much of their knowledge has been lost, but the fragments that remain are terrifying enough. There are ruins, long since abandoned, where machines still hum with a faint, thick, unnatural energy. There are artifacts, locked away in the deepest vaults of the Ordo Malleus, that scholars refuse to study for fear of what they might unleash. And then there are whispers, stories of rogue psychers and chaos-worshipping warlords who have stumbled upon remnants of Uath technology and, in doing so, gained power beyond anything the Imperium is prepared to face. Some fans speculate that the Uath's mastery of the warp wasn't just about power, but about purpose. That they were trying to achieve something vast, something beyond mortal understanding. Were they attempting to ascend beyond physical existence? To carve out their own realm within the warp? To create a god of their own making? We may never know. But one thing is certain. Whatever they were trying to do, The galaxy is lucky they failed. Or at least, that's what we hope. Because if even a fraction of their knowledge still lingers in the shadows, waiting to be rediscovered, then the horror of the Uath may not be as dead as we think. The Uath didn't just rule an empire. They created a nightmare that stretched across the stars. Unlike the Imperium, which at least maintains the illusion of order, or the Tau, who enforce obedience through ideology, the Uath built their domain on an entirely different principle: suffering. Pain was not just a byproduct of their rule, it was the very foundation of their society. They didn't merely conquer worlds, they transformed them into factories of torment, feeding their insatiable hunger for warp energy and total control. At the height of their power, their dominion spread across the calx expanse, a region that would later become part of the Coronis expanse, one of the most lawless and dangerous frontiers of Imperial space. But back then, it was something far worse. The Uath held entire star systems in their grip, each one reduced to a prison of despair. Planets that should have been teeming with life became nothing more than desolate wastelands, their populations either enslaved or utterly broken, stripped of all will. To the Uath, the value of a world wasn't measured in its natural resources or strategic importance. What mattered was how much suffering it could generate. They ruled through fear, not just the fear of death, but the fear of something worse. An eternity of agony, an existence without escape. Those who submitted were turned into tools, reshaped into horrific servitors bound by arcane technologies that blurred the line between flesh, machine, and daemon. Those who resisted were given a different fate. There are stories of entire civilizations being wiped out, not because they fought back, but because their suffering was no longer useful. The Uath didn't just want slaves, they wanted subjects who could be broken and reshaped, over and over again, fueling their empire's endless hunger for warp energy. This is what made their rule so utterly alien. Even chaos-worshipping warlords, as cruel as they can be, at least have an end goal, whether it's spreading the will of their gods or achieving some form of dark ascension. The Uath, on the other hand, seemed to rule for the sake of pure, unfiltered torment. There was no grand ideology, no higher purpose. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were harvesters of despair, treating entire populations as livestock for their horrific rituals and experiments. There are whispers of what life under the Uath was truly like. The few records that remain suggest that their cities, if they could even be called that, were vast, pulsating horrorscapes filled with unnatural structures that radiated psychic agony. Some say their capital worlds weren't built, but grown, shaped from the tortured forms of those they had conquered. It's even been theorized that the Uath didn't need to enforce their rule with military might, because the very presence of their dominion warped the minds of those within it, reducing any thoughts of rebellion to empty despair. Their technology only reinforced this nightmare. Unlike the Imperium, which maintains its power through overwhelming force, or the Eldar, who manipulate through cunning and speed, the Uath wielded weapons that attacked the very essence of their victims. Psychic parasites, soul-draining engines, and constructs designed to leech the will from entire populations were all tools of their rule. Some theories even suggest that their ships were not piloted in the traditional sense, but rather powered by the eternal suffering of those trapped within them, their anguish sustaining the Uath's continued existence. It's terrifying to think about how much of their empire has been lost to time. The Imperium, in its arrogance, believes it wiped them out completely. But the void is vast, and the Uath were nothing if not patient. There are ruins that still hum with unnatural energy, cursed artifacts that still whisper with the echoes of their former masters. Some rogue traders and inquisitors believe that the Uath were never truly destroyed, merely dormant, waiting for the right moment to return. And if that's the case, then the galaxy may yet see the return of one of the darkest, most twisted civilizations to ever exist. When the Imperium first encountered the Uath, it wasn't a simple case of Xenos hostility or territorial dispute. It was something far worse, an existential horror that defied everything the Imperium understood about war, power, and corruption. The Adeptus Administratum records list the Uath as just another Xenos species purged during the Great Crusade, But anyone who looks deeper into their history knows it wasn't that simple. Humanity's first real contact with the Uath likely didn't happen in battle. The Imperium may have stumbled upon their remnants long before realizing what they were dealing with. Explorer fleets charting the Calx expanse reported strange, derelict ships adrift in the void, whispering with residual warp energy. Planets, once thriving with life, were found silent. Their civilizations collapsed without any apparent war. Entire systems had become dead zones, devoid of anything but ruins pulsing with an unnatural presence. By the time the Imperium realized the Uath were still active, it was too late to approach the conflict with caution. The horrors they found were unlike anything they had faced before. This wasn't just another Xenos empire. It was an infestation, a corruption that had already embedded itself deep into the fabric of reality. Uath war engines, powered by the tortured souls of their enslaved populations, turned entire worlds into nightmarish hellscapes. Imperial forces attempting to establish footholds found themselves battling not just enemy warriors, but the very environments themselves. Cities that resisted occupation as if alive. Landscapes shifting under their feet, whispers crawling into the minds of even the most disciplined soldiers. When open war finally broke out, the Imperium was forced to adapt quickly. Standard extermination protocols were useless against an enemy that could manipulate reality itself. Conventional warfare would have dragged on for centuries, costing the Imperium billions of lives. Instead, the High Lords of Terra sanctioned one of the most brutal campaigns in Imperial history, a total purge, a war of annihilation fought with no concern for collateral damage. The exterminatus doctrine was employed on a massive scale. The Imperium did not seek to conquer Uath worlds, it sought to erase them. Planets were reduced to lifeless husks, their populations burned away before they could be fully corrupted. But even this wasn't enough. The Uath were not bound by physical existence in the way normal species were. Their influence lingered in the warp, waiting for any opportunity to spread again. To counter this, the Imperium turned to more extreme measures. The Ordo Malleus, still in its formative years, was tasked with leading the charge against the Uath menace. It was not just a war of soldiers and fleets, it was a war of sorcery, fought with psychic might and forbidden knowledge. The Imperium, normally so rigid in its hatred of the warp, was forced to bend its own rules. Radical inquisitors and sanctioned psychers delved into ancient, dangerous texts, seeking ways to permanently sever the Uath's connection to the immaterial. There are even whispers that entire Grey Knights strike forces were deployed in secret, eradicating not just Uath forces but any human worlds that had been too deeply tainted by their corruption. It's difficult to say exactly when the war ended. Official records state that the Uath were eradicated in the late years of the Great Crusade, but the fact that their artifacts and remnants still exist suggests that something was left behind. Some believe that the Imperium never truly destroyed them, only shattered their power enough to make them retreat into the shadows. There are stories of rogue traders stumbling upon Uath ruins that should have been long dead, only to find the walls pulsing with unnatural life, whispering in a language no mortal should understand. The truth is, the Uath were not an empire in the traditional sense. They were a corruption, a force that did not rely on infrastructure or logistics the way the Imperium or other Xenos species did. Wiping them out completely may have been impossible. The Imperium did what it always does when faced with an enemy it cannot fully comprehend. It buried the truth, destroyed the records, and moved on as if the problem had been solved. But anyone who has studied their history knows better. Whatever the Imperium did to stop the Uath, it was not a victory. It was a delay. And given enough time, delays have a way of running out. The fall of the Uath wasn't just another Xenos extinction at the hands of the Imperium. It was something far more complex, more insidious. For all their power, for all their mastery of the warp, they were not untouchable. The truth is, their destruction wasn't a single, decisive moment. It was a slow, grinding process, one that may not have even truly ended. The Imperium takes credit for their eradication, of course. Official records speak of a glorious purge, a crusade that wiped their kind from the stars. But anyone who studies the Uath knows better. These creatures, whatever they truly were, had spent millennia perfecting the art of surviving through corruption and manipulation. Their empire wasn't built on fleets and fortresses. It was built on ideas, on rituals, on the very essence of suffering itself. A civilization like that doesn't just vanish. But something did change. At some point, their empire collapsed, their influence fractured, their once dominant presence reduced to scattered remnants. The question is, why? The Imperium's war against them was brutal, but it alone shouldn't have been enough to break a species that had bent reality to its will. There had to be something else, some internal weakness, some fatal flaw in their very nature that doomed them. One of the more common theories is that the Uath simply burned too brightly. Their power relied entirely on the consumption of suffering, on the endless cycle of corruption and domination. But there's only so much they could consume before there was nothing left. If their entire society depended on breaking lesser beings, what happened when there were no more to break? Some believe they reached a critical point where they had drained their own dominion dry, feeding on their own slaves to the point of collapse. They may have been functionally immortal, but without the constant agony of others to sustain them, their power would have withered. Then there's the idea that they simply turned on each other. Their culture was built on domination, on the strong ruling the weak, on the relentless pursuit of power through suffering. Empires like that don't tend to last. As the Imperium pressed in, it's possible the Uath fractured, their ruling elite consumed by internal conflict. Perhaps they saw their own kind as the next source of suffering to exploit, and in doing so, they tore themselves apart from within. And then, of course, there are the more unsettling possibilities. Some theorize that the Uath didn't fall in the way we understand, that they didn't truly die, but rather ascended. That whatever sorcerous rituals they spent centuries perfecting, whatever warp-bound experiments they conducted, eventually led them to transcend physical existence altogether. The Imperium may have destroyed their bodies, but what if that was the plan all along? What if the Uath didn't fall, but instead became something even worse? Something that no longer needs material form to exist. The darkest implication is that they are still out there, watching, waiting. That the ruins left behind, the cursed artifacts still pulsing with residual energy, are not remnants of a dead race, but seeds of something waiting to be reborn. That the Imperium's so-called victory was nothing more than a delay, a temporary suppression of a force that was never meant to be fully eradicated. The Uath fell, yes, but whether they were truly destroyed or simply changed into something beyond our understanding remains one of the greatest unanswered questions in the grim darkness of the far future. And if they ever return, it won't be as conquerors. It will be as something far, far worse. The Imperium claims that the Uath are gone, wiped from existence by the fires of war and the relentless march of humanity's conquest. But anyone who's studied the grim history of Warhammer 40k knows that nothing truly disappears. The galaxy is a graveyard of forgotten horrors, and the Uath left behind more than just ruins. Their legacy lingers in the shadows, in the cursed artifacts that whisper to the unwise, in the corrupted machines that refuse to die, in the minds of those who stumble upon their remains and never return the same. If you dig deep enough into the records of rogue traitors and radical inquisitors, you'll find the same disturbing stories repeated over and over again. Worlds abandoned for centuries suddenly show signs of activity, their ruins pulsing with unnatural energy. Explorers vanish without a trace, or worse, return changed, their minds fractured, their bodies marked with sigils no sane being could comprehend. The Uath may have been exterminated in a conventional sense, but their influence never truly faded. The most infamous remnants of their civilization are their artifacts, twisted, eldritch creations that defy logic, weapons that don't just kill but unravel the souls of those they strike, constructs that seem inert until touched, only to awaken with a hunger that can't be explained. There are records of void ships, long thought derelict, suddenly reactivating centuries after their last known sighting, moving with an intelligence that should not be possible. Even the most hardened tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus fear Uath relics, not because they are merely corrupted, but because they seem to exist in defiance of reality itself. One of the most disturbing things about their remnants is that they still function. Most lost civilizations leave behind broken ruins, structures that crumble with time, machines that rust and decay. But Uath creations don't follow those rules. Their constructs are as much sorcerous as they are technological, and their machinery is fueled not by simple physics, but by suffering, by the echoes of the warp itself. Some whisper that their ruins aren't ruins at all, just sleeping giants, waiting for the right moment to stir once more. There are even those who believe that the Uath never truly died, that their consciousness lingers, trapped within the relics they left behind. Some radical scholars theorize that the Uath found a way to bind themselves to the warp permanently, shedding their physical forms, but not their existence. If that's true, then their artifacts aren't just remnants of a lost empire. They're anchors tethering their spirits to reality, waiting for someone foolish enough to reawaken them. The Ordo Malleus takes Uath relics seriously, treating them with the same level of caution as demon weapons and chaos-tainted Xenos technology. Many of their remaining artifacts are locked away in vaults so deep that even mentioning their location is considered heresy. But there are always those who seek forbidden knowledge, those who believe they can control what others fear. Rogue traders, chaos warlords, radical inquisitors, all have been known to seek out Uath technology, thinking they can harness it for their own ends. More often than not, they pay the price. And then there are the ghost stories, the ones whispered among explorers and voidsmen who have seen things they wish they could forget. Derelict ships that respond to psychic thought, corridors lined with metal that pulses like living flesh, symbols that shift when no one is looking. Places where the air feels too thick, where time seems to slip, where thoughts that aren't your own creep into your mind. The question isn't whether the Uath are truly gone. The real question is how much of them still lingers in the forgotten corners of the galaxy, waiting for the right moment, the right hand, the right sacrifice to bring them back. Because if even a fraction of their knowledge survived, if even one great warp engine still hums in the dark, then the nightmare of the Uath is far from over. The Imperium has a bad habit of declaring threats eradicated, only for them to resurface centuries, sometimes millennia later. It's happened with the Necrons, the Genestealer cults, and more chaos uprisings than anyone can count. So when the official records say that the Uath were completely destroyed, that their kind was wiped out during the Angevin Crusade and their empire reduced to nothing, it's hard not to be skeptical. The galaxy is too big, too full of dark corners and forgotten horrors, to believe that something as powerful and insidious as the Uath just disappeared. The question isn't if they could return, it's whether they ever truly left. One of the most persistent theories is that the Uath never saw themselves as bound to a physical existence in the first place. Unlike other civilizations that rely on armies, fleets, and infrastructure, the Uath built their empire on something far more intangible: warp energy, corruption, and the bending of reality itself. Their mastery over the immaterial was so complete that many believe they simply ascended rather than perished. If that's the case, then their return wouldn't come in the form of war fleets or reconstructed strongholds. It would come in whispers, in rituals rediscovered by the wrong hands, in old horrors stirring in places long abandoned. There are already signs that something may be stirring. Rogue traders and explorers who dare to chart the dead systems of the calx expanse report things that defy explanation. Ships that vanish without a trace. Planets that should be uninhabited showing strange energy readings. Entire expeditions returning as something different. The Ordo Malleus is known to monitor Uath ruins with a level of paranoia usually reserved for confirmed chaos incursions. That alone should tell you something. Then there are the artifacts. Uath relics are not like standard Xenos technology. They don't degrade with time. They don't behave according to known physical laws. They act as if they are waiting, as if they are aware. Some believe these objects are not just remnants of a lost civilization, but anchors, points of connection between reality and whatever dark realm the Uath may have retreated into. If that's true, then all it would take is the right event, the right ritual, the right fool tampering with things they don't understand to bring them back. Another possibility is that the Uath never truly existed as a single species, at least not in the way most think. What if they were not a race but a phenomenon? A kind of self-replicating corruption, spreading through civilizations, taking different forms over time? If that's the case, then the Imperium's crusade didn't destroy them, it merely slowed them down. Their essence, their influence, could still be out there, hidden within certain chaos cults, lurking in forgotten warp anomalies, waiting for the right conditions to grow again. And here's the most disturbing theory of all. What if they've already returned, and no one has noticed yet? The Imperium is vast, stretched thin across countless star systems, its ability to monitor every dark corner of space increasingly compromised. If the Uath were to re-emerge, it wouldn't happen with a grand invasion or a massive war. It would happen in secret, through corrupted planetary governors, through hidden cabals of rogue psychers, through artifacts that slowly twist those who possess them. The Uath didn't conquer through brute force. They conquered through manipulation, through the slow, inevitable spread of their influence. If they are coming back, we may not even realize it until it's far too late. The thought is terrifying. The Imperium barely holds itself together as it is. The last thing it needs is another existential threat emerging from the shadows. But the galaxy does not care what the Imperium needs. It is a place of endless war, forgotten horrors, and cyclical destruction. And if the Uath are still out there, waiting for their moment, then the worst is yet to come. The Uath were so deeply entrenched in the warp that it's impossible to discuss them without questioning whether they were connected to chaos in some way. The Imperium, of course, labels them as just another heretical, warp-tainted Xenos race, an abomination that needed to be purged. But the truth is far more complicated. Were the Uath just another pawn of the ruinous powers, like so many others who fell into the grasp of chaos? Or were they something entirely separate, something that even the gods of the warp had no control over? The most obvious assumption is that the Uath were aligned with chaos, willingly or otherwise. After all, they thrived on suffering. Their entire civilization was built on domination, and their sorcery was fueled by the darkest energies of the warp. If any Xenos species was destined to fall into the clutches of the chaos gods, it would be them. Some believe they were directly tied to Slaanesh, given their obsession with pain and excess. Others argue that their hunger for control and power makes them a better fit for Tzeentch. And there's even a case to be made for Nurgle, since their influence seemed to spread like a sickness, corrupting everything they touched. But here's where things get strange. Unlike Chaos cultists or Chaos Space Marines, the Uath never seemed to worship the ruinous powers. There's no record of them building temples to the dark gods, no evidence that they ever called upon demonic patrons for guidance. If anything, their use of warp energy was disturbingly independent. They bent the warp to their will, shaping it as they pleased, without pledging themselves to any higher force. That's unsettling. Even the most powerful chaos sorcerers and daemon princes still answer to something greater. The Uath didn't. They were different. This has led some to believe that the Uath weren't servants of chaos at all, but rivals. That they had discovered a way to manipulate the warp in ways that even the chaos gods couldn't fully control. If that's true, then it makes sense why the Imperium was so desperate to exterminate them. An enemy that not only wielded the power of the warp, but did so without falling into servitude, is an existential threat to the Imperium's entire understanding of reality. And perhaps even more concerning, it could mean that the chaos gods themselves had reason to want the Uath gone. There's also the theory that the Uath weren't just using warp energy, but were something far worse, warp entities themselves, or at least something close to it. Some radical scholars suggest that they had become so intertwined with the immaterial that they were no longer a physical species in the way we understand. That their bodies were merely vessels, temporary constructs that could be discarded and replaced at will. If that's true, then it could explain why they never truly aligned with chaos. They weren't mortals who needed to make pacts with dark gods to wield power. They were something else entirely. And then, there's the possibility that they weren't independent, but were instead serving something even older and more obscure than the chaos gods. The Warhammer 40k universe is full of strange, forgotten horrors. Things that lurk in the deep warp, beyond even the grasp of the ruinous powers. Entities like the Hood's ancient god, the enigmatic beings that the Old Ones once fought, or even something that predates chaos itself. Could the Uath have been worshippers or servants of such a being? Could their entire civilization have been a means of bringing something truly alien into the material realm? The idea that the Uath may have been tied to something beyond chaos is one of the more unsettling theories floating around among Warhammer lore enthusiasts. If they truly operated outside the influence of the Dark Gods, then their destruction may have had nothing to do with the Imperium's crusade. Perhaps they were wiped out because their power had reached a level that even the Chaos Gods could not tolerate. Perhaps their empire was snuffed out not by human hands, but by the will of something even more terrifying. And if that's the case, then the real horror isn't what they were. It's what they may have been trying to summon. If the Uath aren't truly gone, if even a fraction of their influence still lingers in the dark corners of the galaxy, then the Imperium is sitting on a time bomb it doesn't even know exists. Warhammer 40k is already teetering on the edge of catastrophe. The Great Rift has torn the galaxy apart. Chaos is stronger than ever. The Necrons are awakening in force, and the Tyranids continue their endless consumption. The last thing the galaxy needs is another existential horror creeping out of the void. But that's exactly what could happen. The Uath, if they return, won't come as an invasion fleet or a conquering army. That's not their style. They don't wage war like the Orcs, who crash down on worlds in endless waves of destruction. They don't operate like the Necrons, awakening in mass numbers to reclaim their lost empire. And they certainly don't function like the Tihau, who seek to expand their influence through a blend of diplomacy and military force. The Uath thrive in secrecy, in corruption, in the slow, insidious rot that spreads before anyone realizes it's too late. If they return, it will start small. One artifact rediscovered, one cult awakening ancient knowledge, one rogue psyker stumbling upon something they shouldn't. And from there, the infection will spread. For the Imperium, this is a worst-case scenario. It barely has the resources to fight the enemies it already knows about, let alone a hidden threat that doesn't announce itself until it's far too late. The Uath were masters of bending minds, of twisting entire civilizations into their tools without the victims even realizing it was happening. Imagine a governor of a backwater imperial world slowly falling under their influence, making small changes, instituting strange new policies, shifting the culture of their planet ever so slightly. By the time the Inquisition notices, it wouldn't be a heretical uprising. It would be an entirely new kind of enemy, something the Imperium isn't prepared to fight. The true nightmare scenario is that they never really needed to return in force. What if they never truly left? What if they are already embedded in forgotten places across the Imperium, lying dormant, waiting for the right moment? The Uath didn't just conquer worlds, they reshaped them, corrupted them at a fundamental level. How many seemingly abandoned ruins still hum with residual energy? How many lost ships, drifting through the void, carry relics that should have been destroyed long ago? The Imperium is filled with superstition and paranoia, but in this case, they might not be paranoid enough. And then there's the question of how their return would affect other powers in the galaxy. Would Chaos see them as a threat, an independent force that could challenge their dominion over the warp? Would the Necrons, the ancient enemies of all things psychic, recognize the Uath as a major existential threat and act before it's too late? Would the Eldar, who have seen their civilization fall to excess and corruption, step in to prevent another great tragedy? Or would the galaxy simply fail to realize what was happening until it was far too late? For some fans, the idea of the Uath returning is one of the most fascinating what-ifs in Warhammer 40k lore. They represent a kind of horror that hasn't been fully explored. A force that doesn't fight conventionally, but instead infiltrates, mutates, and manipulates reality itself. A force that doesn't need to burn planets to win, but simply needs to twist enough minds, to reshape enough people, until their victory is inevitable. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. Because if the Uath are still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their moment, then the war for the future of the galaxy isn't just about who has the biggest fleets or the deadliest weapons. It's about something far more insidious. It's about control, about who truly shapes the reality of the 41st millennium. And if the Uath were ever to seize that control, the Imperium, and perhaps even the entire galaxy, would never be the same again. The Uath were never a conventional empire, and that makes predicting their future almost impossible. Every other major faction in Warhammer 40k operates within some kind of framework. The Imperium fights to survive, the Necrons seek to reclaim their lost empire, Chaos wants to spread its corruption, and the Tyranids consume everything in their path. The Uath, on the other hand, were never about survival or conquest in the traditional sense. They existed to dominate, to reshape reality, to twist sentient life into something beyond recognition. Their goals were never as simple as power or expansion. They sought something deeper, something darker. If they are still out there, lurking in some form, the biggest question isn't just whether they will return, but how they would return. Would they attempt to rebuild their old dominion, gathering the scattered remnants of their kind to rise once more? Or would they evolve into something entirely new, adapting to a galaxy that has changed drastically since their supposed extinction? Unlike the Necrons, who had a clear plan for their reawakening, the Uath were never bound to a single way of thinking. Their entire existence revolved around transformation, corruption, and bending the rules of reality to suit their needs. If they return, it won't be in the way anyone expects. There are already signs that something is stirring. The Coronis expanse, once their domain, remains one of the most unstable and mysterious regions of space. Uncharted worlds still bear the scars of their rule, and more than a few expeditions have vanished without a trace while attempting to study their ruins. Even more unsettling are the rumors of certain Chaos warbands seeking out Uath artifacts, believing them to hold secrets even the dark gods do not possess. If that's true, then the implications are terrifying. Chaos has always relied on the fickle will of its gods, but what if someone unlocked a different path to power, one that bypasses the need for servitude to the ruinous powers entirely? Some theorists suggest that the Uath's greatest strength is also their greatest danger. Their independence from chaos. If they were truly able to manipulate the warp without bending to the will of the dark gods, then that alone makes them a threat to the established order of the galaxy. The Imperium fears chaos because it is an uncontrollable force, a tide that erodes reality itself. But the Uath were something else entirely. They were surgeons, sculptors of the warp, beings who bent its power with precision instead of reckless devotion. If they ever find a way to return, they could challenge everything the galaxy understands about the immaterial realm. And what happens if someone or something decides to bring them back? What if a radical inquisitor seeking forbidden knowledge stumbles upon the remnants of their lost empire and decides to use their power against chaos? What if a desperate chaos lord, tired of bowing to the whims of the gods, turns to Uath relics as an alternative source of strength? What if a rogue trader, greedy and reckless, unleashes something they cannot control? The galaxy is full of ambition, and the Uath's legacy is a temptation unlike any other. Maybe that's the real threat. Not that they will return on their own, but that someone will bring them back. That someone will think they can harness their knowledge, control their relics, or use their secrets to gain an edge in the endless wars of the 41st millennium. And when that happens, when someone takes that final step into the abyss, the Uath may not need to return in force. They may already have won. The Uath are one of those mysteries in Warhammer 40k that refuse to stay buried. Officially, they're extinct, another Xenos empire purged by the might of the Imperium, reduced to nothing more than dust and forgotten ruins. But the deeper you dig, the more you realize that their story isn't so simple. They weren't just another alien species crushed by humanity's expansion. They were something different, something far more dangerous, a force that didn't rely on armies and fleets, but on corruption, manipulation, and an understanding of the warp that defied everything the Imperium thought it knew. That's what makes them so terrifying. They didn't need to fight like other empires. They could worm their way into a civilization, break it down from the inside, and reshape it in their own twisted image. The Imperium may have destroyed their physical domain, but ideas, knowledge, and dark legacies don't die so easily. The galaxy is littered with the remnants of their empire, artifacts still humming with unnatural energy, ruins that refuse to decay, strange anomalies that don't quite fit into any known pattern. These aren't just relics of the past. They're warnings. And maybe, just maybe, they're pieces of something waiting to be put back together. If even a fraction of what's theorized about the Uath is true, then their extinction is anything but certain. What if they were never truly a species, but a phenomenon, a form of sentient corruption that spread like a virus? What if they transcended physical existence, their essence lingering in the warp, waiting for the right conditions to re-emerge? Or what if the Imperium, in its arrogance, simply assumed it had won, erasing records, covering up loose ends, and leaving behind just enough for the Uath to one day rise again? Warhammer 40k is a setting built on cycles of destruction and resurgence. The Necrons were thought to be a myth before they started waking up. The Tyranids were just another Xenos threat before they revealed their true scale. The Imperium has spent 10,000 years assuming it is the dominant force in the galaxy, but every day that illusion cracks just a little more. If the Uath do return, it won't be with a grand invasion. It will be through whispers, through old horrors stirring in forgotten places, through small changes that snowball into something unstoppable. And if they ever truly reawaken, then the galaxy is in for a threat unlike anything it has faced before. Not just another war, not just another apocalypse, but a fundamental shift in how power is understood. Because the Uath didn't seek simple conquest, they sought control. Not over planets or star systems, but over reality itself. And if that doesn't send chills down your spine, I don't know what will. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the mysteries of Warhammer 40k, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. What do you think really happened to the Uath? Do you believe they're truly gone, or are they waiting for the right moment to return? Let's discuss in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.